I'm Andrea Isabel Lucas, founder of Bar and Soul and author of Own It All. The Own It All podcast is all about how to stop waiting for change and start creating it because your life belongs to you. Every week, I interview inspiring women and they share their tips about how to own it all in the various areas of your life, like career, time management, health, style, and relationships. Tune in every week so they can share their advice with you. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review in your favorite listening app. Hi, I'm Andrea Isabel Lucas, and you are listening to the Own It All podcast. I'm very excited today because our guest is Alexia Vernon. Alexia is a transformational speaking and women's leadership expert, coach, and author of Step Into Your Moxie. She has built her career on helping women find their voice and speaking up for women's empowerment. If you have been to any of my studios, you've seen Alexia's book for sale there. I'm a huge fan of the book. I'm a huge fan of your work, Alexia. And Alexia and I actually worked together on a keynote speech that I was preparing, and I think we found each other like through a Facebook ad. And I was like, oh, a feminist women's empowerment speaking coach. She's awesome. I need to connect with her. So I'm very excited that we connected, and I'm very excited that you'll be speaking with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, you are one of the reasons why anytime I get really frustrated with Facebook ads, I remember, but this kind of relationship is possible.
Exactly. It's not all
swarmy and frustrating.
Yeah, complicated and weird metrics and Russian Twitter bots and whatever. All right. So Lex, when I was thinking about people that I wanted to interview for my book, I had this chapter called Own Your Past. And the reason that I included that chapter was because for me, one of the kind of big breakthroughs in my early 30s was really recognizing how much you can drag your past around with you and let it influence your future, and really getting okay with putting the past in the past and being able to create a future free from any constraints that you've put on yourself based on your past circumstances. And I knew this was a little bit of a heavy chapter. In fact, it's a lot to actually ask somebody to speak about. But I thought of you and I thought, well, speaking is what you do, and you're very self-expressed, but also you're very outspoken about owning your past and not letting it define you, but also using it as a springboard to create an even better future, perhaps. You've been really open about sharing your experience with childhood sexual abuse and finding the courage to speak up about that and stepping into your moxie. I'm curious to hear, how important has forgiveness been in moving on from that experience, even when you didn't receive the support that you expected from some people close to you?
Forgiveness has been everything for me. And what I mean by that is when I spoke up and out about a family member who had been sexually abusing me and my family, as you alluded to, there were some family members who completely championed me, who clung to every word that I said, and who made sure that I got the therapy that I needed in order to be able to live a pretty normal childhood. I don't think anyone's childhood is perfectly normal, but
Right.
Mine was okay. I would use that word. And yet there were other family members who were not ready for that information that I shared, who went in a few different directions, in some cases saying, I think you're doing this for attention. In other cases saying, well, maybe it did happen, but I think you've got the wrong family member. But what I saw happen was that irrespective of the choices somebody made in the immediate aftermath, it caused a lot of, I wouldn't even use the word tension, but a lot of combustion in my family. And with all the therapy and healing that I did, truthfully, I didn't tap into forgiveness until I was in my late 20s. I mean, maybe I gave it some lip service, but I use the Oprah definition of forgiveness, that it is really letting go of the hope that the past could have turned out differently than how it did.
Yeah.
And until I got to that point where, as a practice daily, I sent love and forgiveness, not only to the perpetrator, but to everybody else who was at least in some way complicit in that person being able to not only do what he did to me, but not having to take responsibility and therefore likely perpetuating the cycle of abuse toward others. Until I got to that point, I found that I wasn't living my fullest, to use your phrase that I love, most expressed life. I wasn't able to have the financial success because I was always operating from a place of scarcity that I've been able to have since then. I had a host of physical ailments that would pop up at different points that when I would, in later years, because of course the Google was not around when I was in elementary, middle, or even high school well, no, the internet was around when I was in college. What am I saying? But like, there was not an easy way to know, like, oh, these ailments, these weird ailments all seem to hit those who've been sexually abused. But like, it wasn't until I had done that deeper work that life started to transform in all spheres of life.
Wow. That sounds like it would have been quite a burden to have to, obviously, dealing with recovering from that trauma as a child. Also, the hurt that I'm sure went along with not being believed, not getting the support that you were expecting. And it sounds like that manifested itself in a variety of ways until you were in your late 20s. What allowed your mindset to change, and or what steps did you take to begin the forgiveness process?
One of the things I said in our interview for your book was that forgiveness was not something I woke up one morning and said, all right, this is on my to-do list. Let's check it off. It was a mindset and the awareness that I needed behaviors to match that mindset, that I really wanted to unhook from that cord that was still toxically connecting me to my abuser and to other family members. I really wanted not only to sever that cord, but also keep myself from being trapped in that story. That was, no matter how I tried to frame it, whether I was a victim or even a survivor, it never felt like it had space for me to be a thriver. And through a host of, for lack of a better word, interesting events, I found myself on the board for a nonprofit here in Las Vegas where I live. And initially I thought I was going to be volunteering with those who had experienced sexual abuse and assault as children. But what I started to learn from being on the board was that the program that had the most need for volunteers, and in a moment, you won't be surprised why that was their sex offender treatment program. And what some of the staff members were reporting to the board was that there were a host of reasons why men would be in the sex offender treatment program. I mean, I hate to create a spectrum of sexual assault, but what I now know is there definitely is. From that young person who is sentenced to statutory rape for dating someone, even if it's consensual, younger if the parents of that person choose to press charges, and that young person, oftentimes a young man, doesn't have the ability to pay for representation in court, to that person who is a serial rapist. But in all these cases, all of these men served their time and ultimately were released and now had to do this sex offender treatment as a part of either their probation or parole or release, and couldn't find jobs, and were oftentimes in very desperate situations, which is the last thing you want for any kind of offender who's transitioning back into the community if your goal is preventing recidivism. And so at that time, I was doing more career coaching than speaker coaching, and nobody asked directly, Lex, would you go volunteer with these men? But I felt something deep, an intuitive hit for sure, that I'm supposed to do this work, that it will be challenging, and it also probably will be very healing. And so I did. I volunteered a few times a month doing career coaching sessions with the men who were in this program. And while I learned a lot of things about all the difficulties that I really had never had an opportunity to learn about, all these difficulties that those who have been incarcerated face when it comes to securing housing and securing employment, what I also started to hear, because when you talk about survival, people get very vulnerable with you, was seeing men really go into their stories of why they committed the acts that they did, hearing in many cases bearing witness to their own stories of abuse, and recognizing that the person who committed these acts against me was not a bad person. As Brene Brown, who's one of my favorite thought leaders, would say, he did bad things.
Mm-hmm.
And that started a chain reaction of really positive healing for me as a result.
It sounds like you had the opportunity to completely take a new perspective and develop compassion where there hadn't maybe been space, or not even that you didn't have the space to feel compassion, but that you hadn't had the opportunity to truly feel compassion, or to have, I guess, the perspective to have
Yeah.
compassion for people who do commit these crimes.
And that's exactly what it is, that when we are so myopic and in our own story, it's really hard to illuminate what the perspective might be for the other people who are involved in our story. And that's one of the reasons I love your book. You share your stories. And when we hear stories, self-healing can be possible because we inevitably read ourselves into the examples that other people are sharing. And at the same time, it helps us to open our worldview. I mean, I would have never thought for years that I would be sitting in a room, in some cases with violent offenders, hearing their stories. And yet, of the dozens of men who I would really use the word opportunity, if not privilege, to support in trying to secure employment and in some cases housing. And every single one, you saw a human.
Mm-hmm.
I heard a story of a human being. In most cases, men who were by that point taking full responsibility because they'd already served their time. So there was no fear that if I share what I've done, I'm going to go to jail. Like, been there, done that. To then recognize I was playing a role in hopefully ensuring that these men were not driven back to the acts that they had done before, that were always coming from a place of fear.
I'm curious, were these men aware that you were a survivor of abuse?
Great question. Yes, they were.
Okay, so that it allowed them to see things from your perspective as well.
Yes.
Wow,
There was a lot of story sharing.
that's really powerful. Speaking of Brene Brown, I was just thinking about how in my book I talk about the 4 agreements, and the 4th agreement has always been like kind of the trickiest one for me, which is always do your best. And actually, I was at a really funny presentation recently about anxiety, and the psychologist was saying, never say to a perfectionist, have you done your best? Because like a perfectionist will never think they've done their best. But to kind of put the Brene Brown spin on it, she has written about really having the perspective that everyone is doing their best. Everyone actually is doing their best, and everyone's best is very, very different because they've had different resources and different experiences. And I think that is a very powerful shift. And I will say that, first of all, thank you for sharing. That's very powerful, and doesn't sound like an accident that you found yourself in that position to develop relationships with people that you probably would have seemed very other prior to that experience. I had a similar experience around forgiveness. As I was saying, for you, it was your late 20s. For me, it was kind of my early 30s. And I actually did this course called the Landmark Forum. And then after that, the Landmark Advanced course. And I will say that to try to explain all the things that went into it's a 1 weekend course, but to try to really explain it, it would be too much. But I'll just say that when I went into that course, I really was an angry feminist. And I really believed in us versus them. And I think there's this whole us versus them narrative that we live inside of. And every stinking movie, every episode of, the cartoons that I watched as a little kid, even the Smurfs, it was like there were the villains and the heroes. And so I really had this sense of black and white, us versus them, good versus bad. And for me, kind of my moment of forgiveness really came out of a couple things, but it was realizing that, to your point, the Oprah quote, or Lily Tomlin says something like, forgiveness is giving up all hope for a better past. It's like you're suffering for something that can never be real. you can never ever have this different past. So like recognizing that you're suffering for wanting something that's impossible and just to use your phrase, kind of cutting that cord. But also, I think developing compassion is really huge and just realizing that people can do horrible things, but that doesn't mean that they are horrible people or that they can't be saved. And I think, yeah, for me, when I started to have that breakthrough around forgiveness, it was like realizing that, I went into that course like very angry feminist, like us versus them. Like basically, there were good guys and not good guys. And really, to me, not good guys were like a lost cause. These are people who, were abusive to women or even like just disrespectful to women. It was kind of like I just had a hard stop. And it was like, see you later. Like, can we just like pack them up and send them off to like a space station somewhere? Like, we don't need them. We can't help them. We can't fix them. Like, that was really my mentality. And I really was able finally to take their perspective, see that every human being has dealt with some kind of suffering in their life and has reacted accordingly. And I guess to kind of repeat the phrase, the actions that they've taken were their best at that time. But also, like, if there's no hope for abusers, then what does that say for our future? Like, how do we
Exactly.
evolve as a culture, as a society, as humans, if we can't help those that are hurting and hurting others?
I didn't recognize for a long time that one of the greatest threats to other girls and boys like me was that so many people who committed an act, and if it had been any other act that was less demonized and could have raised a hand, I mean, take addiction, for example, and said, I need help, and gotten it, that could have been the thing that prevented that offender from offending over and over and over again. And I realize this is not a podcast specific to judicial reform. It is interesting that one of my clients currently is very involved in that process, and it's been the next chapter in my own fascination with how do we get our courts working on behalf of communities. It sounds like I'm talking about getting it right for offenders, but to me, it's actually a community issue. If we're serious about curbing crime in communities, it's ultimately about really treating those people who come into the court system. But that, one of the best things I ever learned from therapists who were working with offenders was that the number one way to know that someone is likely not to reoffend is when they are able to take full responsibility for what they have done and say, I did this, and to exhibit empathy for their victims. And I'm sorry, and I understand the impact. And most of that deep therapeutic treatment happens when people are reintegrated in society, not, of course, when they're serving their time or when they raise their hand and say, I did something. And yet we penalize people for coming forward and saying, I did something. So it's all very complicated that if we want people to take responsibility and then we punish them and put them away and don't give them therapy when they do. But something else you said that I think is really important, because when I've had this conversation with folks over the years, one of the things I'll often hear about me, which I feel deeply uncomfortable about, is, Lex, it feels like you did all this great healing and you're in a place where you have forgiven. And now I'm beating myself up comparing where I am in my healing journey to yours. And I love when you said that we all respond differently. And a big piece of that is the resources. And I would go so far as to say the privileges that we've been afforded. I'm very cognizant that because of privileges due to the zip code where I grew up, to the private school education I had, to a mom who, while by trade was a nurse, really dedicated her life to making sure that I got better. Like, all those things played a very powerful role in my ability to get to the place that I am now. And I wish everyone had those abilities, because if you didn't come into the world with that kind of privilege, I see the light in you and acknowledge that comparing your beginning in this journey to my middle or to my 3/4 of the way through is only going to amplify the need for you to ultimately not just go through forgiveness for the other people who might be involved in your story, but that deeper self-forgiveness work as well.
Oh gosh, yeah.
But I want everyone who's listening to know you did the best you could with whatever hand you were dealt.
Yeah, forgiving yourself, I think, is a big part of forgiveness, because usually there is some aspect of self-blame or shame tied to whatever the trauma is. And I also want to say that I think forgiveness is not this linear open and shut process. Sometimes you have days where you're more over it than others. And sometimes, to use the overused phrase, like, you have things that trigger you and that trigger kind of a relapse of really feeling shitty about it all over again and kind of feeling like you're back at square one. And I know I've been in that place and really actually kind of hard on myself or beat myself up, like, oh God, I thought I had moved beyond this. And like now it's just all kind of, the wounds are reopened again. But I think it's not a cut and dried process.
No, and to make a case for self-care, one of the things I see a lot with the speakers that I'm working with is, well, not every speaker chooses to use significant, what I call come to Jesus stories from their lives in their keynotes. Many, even if the subject of their keynote is quite different, choose to integrate some of those stories as evidence, as ways to invite the audience to connect with them. And in revisiting some of those stories, oftentimes old wounds do open back up. And the first thing to go is often exercise, time on the yoga mat at the bar studio, meditation, oils, baths, whatever it is. And the more that we are being triggered, the more we need to come back to that work, the more that we are using our story to serve others, whether it's on stage, in a TV interview, writing a book, leading a retreat, whatever it is, the more we need to come back to holding space for ourselves to be with this stuff, to send, if you're anything like me, white light to the people that we realize that cord might still be attached to. It's not like it has to be this active forgiveness work. Some of it is holding the intention and sending white light, energy, love, whatever works for you to that person or to those people. But the other is giving ourselves time to be without suppressing all the stuff if and when it does choose to revisit, oftentimes at very inopportune times when we're doing our work in the world.
And I have to say, too, for me as a survivor of abuse, I get so sick of talking about it. Like, I think that people might think I enjoy talking about it because I do talk about it a lot. And, you know, I was on a panel last year about women in leadership. And when I had like 2 minutes to introduce myself, and I did include that I'm a domestic violence survivor. And, you know, in my book, it goes right to that, because actually there was a draft of my book, like somewhere along the way, that started out with life how it looks now. And actually just reading it made me like throw up in my mouth, because it was just sounded so privilegey and like, my life is so awesome. And like, my kids are great and my business is so cool and I'm awesome. And I just was like, no. Like, nobody's going to like me or want to hear anything from me if I come across like this perfect life, like goody two shoes. And I was like, no, we have to start with the ugly stuff and then show the progression. And I do think it takes a lot to share that. And I just want to acknowledge that it's not really fun to keep rehashing it or keep bringing it up again and again, at least not for me. I don't know if it's different for you, but at the same time, I feel like I am doing a service to others who have been through whatever they've been through, however similar or not that it might be to my story. I just feel like I want to give hope to those that are either in the thick of it now or carrying around a lot of pain from the past, to really show them that, like, no, I've totally been there too, and you can move past it.
One of the most helpful shifts I made for myself was stopping the false belief that I would get to a certain place in life and then things that bothered me would never bother me again, or that I would figure out, I mean, in business as well, like I would figure out the recipe for enrolling people into X program or whatever it is. And then it's like, okay, you mastered the knowledge, now just keep doing it. And that, you know, because you've had one trauma, that other things won't rock you in quite the same way. And what's funny is that sometimes the things that rock us are so mundane when we look back on them. But at the time, they can almost derail us as much as the big epic stuff we might have already moved through previously. Recognizing that what does shift is our use and knowledge of the tools we have to support us in the difficult times. And while we cannot predict when an old wound will open, when life will throw us a shit sandwich or anything else, knowing that we do have the tools and we have the history to look back and say, if I've been resilient before, I can be resilient again. And trust that however long something is going to derail us, it won't be permanent. It will be a pit stop, allows us to get through things a little bit more easily. And for me, another big piece of that has been bringing in humor and play and recognizing that I can be on the ground blubbering, and that doesn't mean that I can't still laugh and find humor in the ridiculousness of a situation. Like, a situation can be very funny and very tragic, and then I also can't step out of it and go listen to a podcast or go watch a TV show and laugh my brains out. Like, that's somehow not honoring the sadness, depression, anxiety, or grief that I'm in.
That's such a great point, is that there's no one right way to handle your trauma or your grief. Like, you're not locked into one way of thinking or one way of being. And I think that's actually I could make that part of the argument for forgiveness, is that, like, you don't have to forgive. Like, you actually don't have to. Like, lots of people don't. And there's just the opportunity to look at, like, okay, well, what I'm doing now and the mindset that I'm in and how I'm responding to my situation now, how is it working for me? How do I like it? How do I feel? Could I feel better? Is there maybe a way that might feel uncomfortable to shift my way of thinking about the situation, but would it help me feel better? And making that choice. And you don't have to, ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, if whatever you're in, however you're showing up is serving you, then cool. I don't know anyone who is willing to be transparent who said holding on to toxicity toward another person is actually serving me. Because that's the important distinction between forgiveness and forgetting, is that forgiveness is not letting people off the hook for what happened. It can still be holding them accountable. It is, and the definitions that I like to use, simply letting go of that hope that I, them, anybody else involved could have done something differently, or that what happened didn't happen. And that I'm going to be defined by another person's actions. Forgiveness is inherently about owning it all, or my brand message of stepping into your moxie. It's about choosing to become the protagonist of the story of your life again.
Hey, it's Andrea here. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I just wanted to take a moment to tell you that my book, Own It All, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. So if you go to ownitallbook.com, you can get my exclusive pre-order bonuses. I'll be sharing with you one mindset shift and some practical tools that will help you get whatever it is that you want in the areas of health, wellness, career, relationships, time management. I've got journaling pages to share with you there and some exclusive audio content. So be sure to pre-order your copy now and get those bonuses, ownitallbook.com. So that brings up a really awesome point, because I always feel like I have to be careful when I am encouraging people to let go of a victim mentality. I feel like as soon as you say victim mentality or victim mindset, people get defensive, and understandably so.
It's always a sign we have it. I'll say it. You don't have to.
What's that?
If the idea of entertaining the thought that I could be acting like a victim is triggering, it means that you are likely in that space.
Ooh, yes. And
because
don't you think it can sound unfeminist or uncompassionate toward victims, right? And that can trigger defensiveness too.
The belief that somebody should be at a place where they can do anything, to me, is the gross part. Telling someone they should forgive before they're ready, I'm 100% on board. Yeah, gross. We do it when we're ready. Being a truth teller, being an unapologetic truth teller, bringing bravery and compassion to throwing down the truth is the ultimate act of feminism, in my opinion, whether we're talking about the personal or the institutional. or the connections between the two. And one of the things I know we're aligned with, Andrea, is this notion that feminism has to look a particular way and that self-improvement can't be a part of the feminism conversation. Like you, I spent years being an angry feminist. And I would have been the first person, if you talked about anything related to self-help within the sexual abuse, domestic violence, homophobia, racism, any systems of oppression, like anywhere in that conversation, I similarly would have upchucked in my mouth a little bit. And yet, when I got to that point and realized if I want to do my best work in the world and be a champion for the rights of others, and in some way use my voice to try to speak out against patriarchy and systems of oppression that are hurting all of us, if I don't get my own shit together, if I don't feel like I am a moxie full, I'm not going to be able to make the biggest impact. And these days, when I hear things that I disagree with, if they're not triggering me, I know I'm okay. But when I'm triggered, I know that something is up, because I can watch a political figure whose ideas I disagree with on every level. And in the past, I couldn't do that without needing to like blurt out and get angry. And that's different than being complacent and disassociating and saying that doesn't affect me. But now my default question is, what can I do with the feelings that are coming up? And that always feels like it's being stirred around from an energy of compassion and a desire to do better, to say more, rather than a desire to be right.
That's it. That's really it. And the thing of it is, like, being right, what does that get you? You know, making them wrong and being right.
Like, of course it's wrong if someone committed abuse.
Right,
you
exactly.
know? Like, I'm not trying to ever make that not wrong.
Right.
I know I'm right. And now what?
Exactly. Yeah. One of the things that led to me having that breakthrough of forgiveness that I was talking about earlier when I was doing that course was I was really kind of objecting to what was kind of being suggested in the course, which was like, just take responsibility for your part in things. And I was like, I'm not taking responsibility for my part in me being abused. Like, this is crap. And the leader actually, I had like a side conversation with them, and they said to me, what would it be like if you got to give up proving that you were right and he was wrong? And I didn't know I was still doing that until that moment. And it had been already many years since anything had happened. And I realized, God, what a waste of energy at this point that actually is. And I am so ready to be all done. And I don't have to prove that to anybody. And to your point, like, it was wrong. Like, that's not up for debate, really. So why keep fighting to prove it? And then what does that free up? Where can you go from there now that you're not stuck in proving that you were a victim? Where can you go next?
And I agree. I've heard that language before. And there were times when I was definitely not ready for it either, that kind of question, because I would say I was 4 years old. What are you talking about? What role I played?
Right.
I now am a huge fan of the question, what was I supposed to learn from that experience? Not did I choose it, because that gets mucky, but like, what's the question that experience has set me up to answer? And there's not a shadow of a doubt for me that the stuff I experienced in my family was there to teach me about forgiveness. Like, I know that now, that I was somebody who held grudges on the pettiest of things. And things kept showing up, not always that dramatic, to give me the opportunity to learn the lesson that I didn't learn for a long time around the abuse. And when we look back in our life, of course, hindsight always feels somewhat 2020. Is that how that cliche goes? But usually the stories, the circumstances might change, but the lesson is the same. And until we give ourselves the gift of learning it once and for all, it'll simply keep coming back to us in a different disguise.
I think I'm really glad that you brought that up, because one thing that I talk about in the book, and that has been super helpful for me, is looking at what role did I play in the situation? What can I take responsibility for? And sometimes that can be so empowering. And I know it sounds counterintuitive because everyone's always telling women they need to stop apologizing and whatever. And it's not even necessarily saying, that you were at fault or to blame. It's not even necessarily about laying blame. But in a lot of situations, there are things that it's like, oh, I just had, say, a bad interaction with, I don't know, a coworker or something. And I can make a list of everything that they did that wasn't great in the situation. But if I step back, I can actually start to look at some of the things that I did that contributed or that weren't great. And maybe some of it was out of my control. Like, I don't know, I was out sick that day and they had to pick up the slack or something. But there is something actually surprisingly empowering about looking at like, oh yeah, I guess I did play a role in this. And it helps you let go of that feeling of like victim of like, oh, everybody's messing with me. That's super useful and super powerful. And there's times when it doesn't apply at all. Like when you're 4 years old and someone's abusing you, like it's completely inappropriate in that situation. So I like that you have this other tool that you're sharing about, okay, then what was the lesson that was there for me to learn? Because it's still taking that feeling of like, this shouldn't have happened kind of out of the mix and instead looking at like, okay, well, why was this experience necessary for my, I guess, spiritual growth and evolution? So you are a mom and your daughter is, I want to say now about the same age that you were when you went through your abuse and when you spoke up and stepped into your moxie for the first time, when you shared that was happening to your parents. What has that been like?
Yes, we actually had to stop recording for a moment because my daughter was expressing herself in the background. She is a little over 6 months older. She just turned 5. Than I was when I did speak up. And because I chose to speak up on Christmas, my birthday is the first of a month, I knew to the day exactly how old I was when it happened. And I'm a little strange, some might say macabre, in that I knew when my daughter turned that exact age, like that day that it was happening. We were on a vacation and it was an uncomfortable day where I was triggered left and right by every person who commented that my daughter had big eyes or that she was attractive. Like I felt so mama bear, like I was just going to slug grandmas. We're seeing my daughter for what she looked like rather than who she was. And I wish I had a perfect buttoned up answer to this. Like I know now one of the most difficult experiences I went through was actually postpartum depression. And a huge piece of that was fears that I wouldn't be able to protect my daughter, not only from abuse, but from little things like viruses or because I wasn't able to breastfeed. Like I still had stuff I needed to work through in my own story about my ability to protect her. I've worked on it. Does that mean I'm perfect? Absolutely not. Most of the time I'm okay, but there are still days that feel difficult. And for any of us who have experienced something really wretched, I believe that then, especially as children, it's really hard to completely unhook from not seeing ourselves reflected back in our children or being concerned that now I'm in the paternal role. And even if my parents didn't do a good job, that I'm not equipped to be everything that child needs me to be.
And it's just entirely too much pressure to put on yourself to think that you can avoid her having any trauma ever. It's just not a realistic expectation for any parent, even though, of course, you are committed to that and you will do everything in your power. I was actually chatting on the podcast just yesterday about how like one of my daughter's childhood traumas was when everybody in class in nursery school was being asked a question. And when they got it right, everyone clapped and she got it wrong. And she was fully expecting they would still clap and they didn't. And like that was traumatic for her. So you just can't predict everything and protect them from everything, as painful as that is.
Very true.
Do you ever think about how and when you would start to have age appropriate, of course, conversations with her about your past, since it is rather public?
We have already.
Okay.
One of the reasons why I know that I spoke up and out when I did is because my mom had been having conversations with me about what constitutes safe touch and what to say if and when anyone ever touched me inappropriately. And so I feel when I talk about the spectrum of privilege, incredibly privileged that I had a mom who had done that for
Yeah.
me. I don't know if she intuited something was happening or if she was really just up on her mama game. And so with my daughter, similarly, as soon as she could talk, we started reading books that were age appropriate. She knows all the official names of body parts. She's got as healthy a relationship, I think, as someone her age can have to her entire being, including to her sexuality. Because in our home, both my husband and me don't make anything scandalous. We talk about everything, the good, the bad, and the confusing. And so I had a hunch that at some point she would ask, did anyone ever touch you inappropriately? And she did in the last year. And the key was not making it dramatic. I certainly didn't have to go into the entire story, but really answering the question she asked. And I said, there was somebody who did. And I told Yaya, which is the name of grandma in Greek for my mom. And Yaya got me the help that I needed. So that's why Daddy and I always tell you, you can tell us anything and you will be believed and loved and we will help you. And that was that. She didn't ask another question.
That's great. That's amazing. And I'm not even a little bit surprised that with your message of stepping into your moxie, that you're already setting her up to have really free communication and self-expression and unencumbered by any kind of shame or hushing things up or any awkwardness. That's really a powerful privilege for her, actually.
If I may throw in one more thing about that, that was something I learned. I don't read a lot of books about parenting because I find that it triggers my perfectionism, which has been latent. Yet one of the things I did choose to read on this subject, which makes perfect sense, but I hadn't realized it, was the importance with children of having a no secrets rule. Secrets can be super benign, particularly with girls. I see it all the time with my daughter's friends. They want her to keep a secret about something lame, like, I used crayons to color my doll's face or something. But we've just had an absolute no secrets rule. Secrets hurt. We can have surprises if there's something we don't want to share. But if someone tells you to keep a secret, let's practice what we say in that moment, because that's why abuse is able to be so prevalent for children. Is children love keeping secrets. It's fun. It makes them feel special. So you take that specialness away. I believe we could start a radical revolution in more children speaking up, in addition to giving them opportunities to role play those safe touch conversations.
I completely love that. This is actually the first time I've ever heard about that concept, but it makes total sense. And I immediately went to, for adults, like how healthy of a policy that would be anyway. Like secrets are just usually shrouded in some kind of shame, and it just sounds so liberating not to have them.
One of the webinars that I lead is called Discover Your Secret Sauce. It's been around a long time, probably longer than I've known this information. And every year my daughter says, please, Mom, can we change it to Discover Your Surprise Sauce? I mean, she's like really serious. And, she's right. I gotta rethink that at some point.
Totally different definition, I would say. But
Exactly. But, if you've got a child who's incredibly literal, sometimes it's worth it to acknowledge that or honor that pact that you've
that's
made.
right. It means your message definitely hit home. What is your favorite piece of advice for women in stepping into their moxie and stepping into their voice, their authenticity, their self-expression, however you want to call it?
If you know that your ideas can positively and maybe even radically improve people's lives, businesses, health, careers, sex life, whatever it is, it's not only an opportunity, it's also a responsibility to step into your moxie, to use your voice, to speak up and out for the ideas and issues that matter most to you.
Thank you so much. I love that. And because this conversation was super heavy and serious, what is your favorite funny movie?
Oh,
Or funny show?
that's a good one. One of the moments that's popping up for me is Blockers, which was directed by Kay Cannon, which is the first feminist sex rom-com. I love it for so many reasons. Full disclosure, Kay was one of my improv teachers when I was studying improv back when I was in college. She taught for the Second City here in Las Vegas. And she was a huge player in me recognizing that feminism didn't have to be so serious, that it could be funny, that I could use my body and humor as a way to facilitate insights and transformation for others. And I love that movie. I love how the gals are not all white. They're one of them is LGBT. One of them, I can't remember if she was Indian, but she was definitely biracial. Like, I just love that whole movie in terms of disrupting what we think of as a coming of age sex comedy.
I actually just saw that and I absolutely loved it. Leslie Mann was hilarious. John Cena was hilarious. Like, it was so good. It was super feminist. It's all about like losing their virginity on prom night and like the parents, you know, wrestling with their like patriarchal protectiveness around that.
Even though they're pretty self-evolved.
Yes.
But when it comes to their daughters, suddenly it's really easy to be a hypocrite, something probably most of us, if we are parents, can relate to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That was a great one. And yeah, I just had to throw that in there because I know, like I said, when I was looking at Own Your Past, I'm like, this is kind of a heavy topic. I knew that you'd be totally be game to go there. And I like want people to know that you are fun and funny, and like your public speaking style ranges from like really radical vulnerability to like silliness and playfulness and just not taking yourself too seriously, which I think, and you brought that up as well in this discussion. And I think that is crucial for like sanity.
Thank you. I strive. For a while as an actor, I worked with a theater company called The Stolen Chair. And the mantra was, we create theater in that space between the earnest and the ironic. And that is a way of approaching speaking life that has really resonated with me.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no rule that says we have to take ourselves so seriously, even our traumas, which might sound a little radical, but I think that's okay. Well, it was an honor to have you. I'm so, so grateful for everything that you shared with us today. And I'm so excited for everyone to read your interview in my book, Own It All. I encourage everybody to get a copy of your book, Step Into Your Moxie. I think your message is just so powerful and empowering. And just thank you so much for being with our listeners today.
My pleasure. Thank you for holding space for the conversation. And everybody go pick up your copy of the book. It's fantastic. So, so good.
Thank you. I'm Andrea Isabel Lucas, and this has been the Own It All podcast. Thank you so much for listening this week. If you liked what you heard, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite listening app. It really helps, and I would be so grateful. I'll be back next Wednesday with a brand new episode. See you then.